Good evening, blog viewers. Tonight we'll cycle back to one of the virtues that we have not discussed so much so far, and that is the virtue of silence and stillness. And I thought August would actually be a pretty good time to talk about this virtue because August is, in fact, when you think about it, it's a time when the weather is very hot, people are generally indoors. A lot of people are on vacation, going around Europe and various other countries. The news and the sports calendar in August seems to be somewhat muted. There's very few sports going on right now. This year the Olympics is an exception, but typically there's only baseball going on right now. The news calendar is again generally muted because of a lot of people on vacation. And so August is actually probably one of the most silent months of the year, silent and still months of the year, and so everyone is, in that sense, sort of gearing up for the end of the year. September gets busy, school starts again, and the flow of events starts to pick up. So we could say in this sense that every August is, in a sense, a silent August, and so it's important to think about the virtue of silence and stillness, I think, in the month of August. So we'll do that today. Now, with silence and stillness, like many of the other virtues that we've discussed, I think it's probably best viewed on a 0 to 100 scale, like many of the other virtues. No one would say that the life where someone is silent and still endlessly for their whole life is a good one. On the other hand, no one would say that a life where all we did was talk and all we did was run around busily doing stuff sort of in a frenzied manner is a good one either. There seems to be almost an undisputable consensus that the good life is one where we are pursuing the appropriate mix of silence and stillness for some sort of action and speaking and actual expression, self-expression. And so somewhere between those two extremes lies the proper cultivation of the virtue, I would think. And at any moment in time, we can obviously either choose to be... Any moment in time is actually, in fact, either a silent, still moment or its contrary state. There seems to be no other possibility there. Every single second of existence is either silent, still, you're not saying anything, you're really not hearing anything, nothing is really going on around you, or you're saying something, or someone's talking to you, or something's happening to you. And so those are the two almost states of being. And critically, when we talk or when we are active or we're doing something, these are typically not states of reflection. The reflection or the contemplation about what we're going to do or what we're going to say typically precedes the talking or the action. If someone gives a lecture, they usually write out notes about what they're going to say. Political speeches are no different. And even day-to-day conversation, hopefully, people think a little bit before they're going to say something. There are some people that just say whatever comes immediately to their brain without any reflection, but those people are usually rare. Most people think a little bit before saying what they're going to say. And same thing with action. There's some sort of reflection and pondering of alternatives before people act. So those moments are not silent still. There is always some reflection. Strike that. When we're acting or when we're talking, those are not silent still moments. And again, we need to develop it's important, I think, to develop the right mix of silent still moments versus active speaking moments, and to get that right, get the judgments right about when to speak, when not to speak, when to act, when not to act. These are very, very important things to get right in a human life. But more fundamentally even than that, we have to ask, why is silence and stillness a virtue? It's not listed as a virtue by Aristotle or many of the other Greek philosophers or any other philosophers. And I think there's somewhat of a consensus now or an understanding that silence, stillness, this sort of state of being has certain advantages. I think the answers we typically get are that these states are somewhat people just need time to be, or people just need time to relax. People just need time to enjoy sort of the pleasures of existence. And whatever any of that stuff really means, it's kind of unclear. What does it mean to just be? What does it mean to just be still? And what does it mean that these things are actually good for us? We need to sort of drill down a little bit more, I would think. And these are not sort of bad initial answers, I think, but I think there's more to do. There's more work to do to figure out what actually is good in this virtue. Why would silence and stillness really be a virtue? Why does it really deserve cultivation? Why does it really deserve to be regarded as actually valuable, actually good for a human being? And to do that, to gain some perspective on that, I want to turn to a work we have blogged about several times, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And this book, unfortunately, has some rain damage. That's why it appears a little bit bigger than it is. It's actually a 350-page book or so, and it is quite good. And I want to focus on what Kahneman focuses on for the majority of his work. And for some ideas, again, we're looking at this work to figure out why silence and stillness would be a virtue. And Kahneman, throughout the work, discusses a whole host of various mental biases that pervade people's thinking. And again, these are not specific groups of people, doctors or lawyers, rich or poor. These are seemingly mental biases that operate throughout society, across a whole, across almost everybody, perhaps maybe to the exclusion of someone like Daniel Kahneman, who's aware of these biases. But even he says toward that conclusion that he still, despite knowing these biases very well, he still sees that he is afflicted by them in his own life. So these are very difficult biases to overcome, and they should be, I think, taken very seriously by everyone. And the mental biases, there's very many that Kahneman discusses throughout his work, but I want to focus on a few of them, and I want to focus on the fact that what is in fact common to almost all of these mental biases is that once we see them in the pages of a book, once we read about them, once we articulate the bias, once we see it in sort of Kahneman's description, it becomes incredibly laughable that anyone would think like this. It becomes incredibly irrational. It becomes incredibly foolish and stupid for someone to adopt these kind of biases. But in fact, people are making these kind of errors all the time. So it's important to not lose sight of the fact that in some way, verbalizing these various biases goes very far in understanding them and realizing how they could be operating in our own lives. So I'm going to try to actually discuss them in somewhat specific detail throughout the course of this post. And the most serious, I think, biases that I saw or I took away from Kahneman's book were three, and I want to discuss each one. The first one is this thing that he calls the sunk cost fallacy, and this is, I think, fairly straightforward. Someone thinks, I've put a lot of time into this job, this marriage, this project, this vacation or whatever. Things are not going that well in this job or whatever. Things are not going this well. They're not going well at all. But I don't want to admit defeat. Again, I put a lot of time and effort and energy into it. I don't want to try something else or do something else. I don't want to just admit this was a failure and just move on to the next thing, and hopefully find something that's a better, sort of more fulfilling, that will give me more happiness, that will be more in line with my true capabilities, or that will just go better for me. And so I continue to sort of devote money, time, and resources to sort of trying to fix this broken ship. I don't want to admit defeat. I put in a lot of time and energy into this thing, so I'm going to continue doing it. I'm going to continue trying to fix it and bring about some sort of miraculous recovery. And this is not only, Kahneman stresses, not only a bias for individuals, but it's actually also a bias that affects many organizations and corporations that have spent a lot of time and money on some sort of initiative. So that was sort of one of the first big ones that Kahneman discusses. this is closely allied to another one. In fact, all the three biases I'm going to talk about are somewhat related. The second one is sort of the pervasive bias, the pervasive mental bias of overconfidence and sort of excessive optimism, optimism gone haywire. Optimism, Kahneman stresses, is actually generally a good thing. The happiest people are optimistic. But as with all good things, it has its limits. It's good in that optimism is good in that it helps you stay resilient. You work through initial challenges when there's a setback. But on the other hand, it's bad in that it blinds you to all of the risks that are involved in whatever it is that you're doing. Excessively optimistic, overconfident person systematically continues to underestimate the various risks involved in what he's doing. He either doesn't see them, or if he sees them, he's too optimistic to take them very seriously as being things that could really wreck whatever he is trying to bring about. And Kahneman cites the example of many examples, but he cites the example of CFOs of huge companies. In various studies, they've confidently made very strong projections of where the stock market is going to go in a year. And again, most of the time they had no clue. Their predictions were totally wrong. They confidently made projections, but almost always got things wrong. Startup companies, he discusses this. The management of startup companies are asked, to what extent do you think your efforts are actually going to matter in the success of this venture? Almost everyone thinks that their efforts will matter incredibly, and whatever they put into this thing will ultimately determine success or failure. In fact, in the real world, what happens is other market participants, other actions, unknown risks, unknown regulation, unknown laws, various things, just the whims of the market, the whims of the world. Many of those things actually affect how successful a startup actually is going to be, and not at all reflected to what anyone in the startup is actually doing. And Kahneman cites that as another example. And he also discusses when people make various plans about how things are going to go, various timelines or projections of future events or what things are going to cost. And these predictions of how quickly a project can get completed or how smoothly a certain goal will be achieved or an objective will be reached or in how much time those objectives will be reached, almost all of those Kahneman believes are affected by deep overconfidence, deep excessive optimism that is completely blind to pitfalls, risks, just bad things that could happen, and they systematically result in completely over-optimistic, over-confident assertions of what's going to happen. He gives various examples that are actually very interesting to consider. He gives the example on page 250 of the Scottish Parliament building, and the Scottish Parliament building, it was proposed in July 1997 with an estimated cost of 40 million Scottish pounds, I guess it is. By June 1999, he says, the budget had grown to 109 million. By April 2000, the budget had grown to 195 million pounds. By November 2001, the final cost was estimated at 241 million. The next year, it ended at 294 million pounds. In 2003, it was escalated 3 more times to 375 million. Let's see here. And the building was finally completed in 2004 at an ultimate cost, he says, of roughly 431 million pounds. That is 10 times the initial cost estimate in July of 1997. He gives another example, a very interesting example. He writes, in 2002, a survey of American homeowners who had remodeled their kitchens found that on average they had expected the job to cost about $18,000. In fact, they ended up paying an average of about $40,000, actually $38,769. So again, those are the various projections, various plans as to how much things are going to cost are almost always rosy, almost always wrong, and people continuously get these projections and predictions wrong. He goes on to say, to give the example of a research project that he was personally involved in, and he says everyone in the beginning sort of overestimated how quickly things could get done. They didn't they didn't consider the fact that people would get sick, people would get divorced and be emotionally wrecked, unable to produce their best work. People's commitment to that sort of intense emotional commitment that everyone had in the beginning that would kind of wane over time as other things sort of grabbed their attention. All of these things were ignored, and therefore the project took much longer than expected. And Kahneman writes, summing all of this up, there are many ways for any plan to fail. And although most of them are too improbable to be anticipated, the likelihood that something will go wrong in a big project is high. So there are many things that can wreck even the most well-intentioned efforts. Most of those are unpredictable, but something at some point can usually ruin some sort of project. And that is something that I think people, Kahneman thinks, persistently ignore, persistently just turned a blind eye to for various reasons. One of the reasons, he says, is, again, the need to, I think we've discussed this before, that the sort of the expectation of other people is not this sort of humility, this sort of academic risk-taking, exploration, and bringing up all the things that could go wrong, but confidence, what people won't like in other people's confidence. But that confidence, I think from Kahneman we can see, comes at a price, and it comes at the price of ignoring real risk and sort of overconfidence and sort of an arrogant dismissal of risk, and it ends up being to the detriment of everyone usually involved in the project. As a specific case of overconfidence, actually Kahneman draws attention to many people's overconfidence in this sort of intuitive sense they have as to other people, or sort of this special intuitive judgment they have as to people's character, how certain things will turn out, certain marriages, or certain people's performance in a job. I think in the military that he was in the Israeli military, people were confident they could predict who would be a good soldier. And all of these things, Kahneman says, that actually people's intuitive judgments, despite being very overconfident, are actually way off. People usually, what is better than someone's, quote, intuitive sense of how things are going to turn out, or intuitive sense of other people's character, is just a simple mathematical formula that plugs in various relevant attributes, consistently, sort of unemotionally plugs through the algorithm, spits out some result as to who's going to be the best worker, who's going to be the best soldier, what's the chance of success of a project, and those are much better than sort of these calculated, fine, intuitive judgments. Interestingly, though, again, that's something that people resist very deeply. People don't want to think that a formula, or sort of a dull, plodding, sort of cold academic formula could in any way be better than their human, sort of finely calibrated, intuitive sense of things, and that is deeply offensive to many people, while still being, Kahneman thinks, and based on a very, very extensive series of studies and data across a lot of different cultures, have shown that he's actually right, and most people that have that sense in their intuitive judgment are actually wrong. And again, I want to stress everything that I've talked about so far. These are not just Kahneman's opinions as to various things. These are his pulling out sort of the results of various studies that have been grounded by many analysis and data and interviews of people. So these have all been documented in various studies. Maybe we can dispute the validity of these studies, but he's definitely not speaking from just his subjective judgments. So how does all of this now, I think it's probably clear, but how does all of this apply to the virtue of silence and stillness? And I think the best cure for all of these various mental biases is to devote some time every day or every week to sort of the silent, still reflection, where we can systematically go through our lives and identify the areas of our lives which could in any way be beset by these mental biases, where these biases could be operating systematically and perniciously in ways that are doing us harm. Kahneman makes the point repeatedly that it's easier to identify these kind of mental biases in other people. It's much harder to identify it in oneself. That sort of self-criticality that is so essential to a good life is so lacking in us. that we have to really make an effort to cultivate it, and we have to really make an effort to focus on it intensely. And to do that, I think silence is the best sort of environment to bring about that cultivation. I think in many ways, it's time spent by yourself, thinking about sort of your various silent time or still time spent by yourself, thinking about the various projections and plans you have for the future, sort of various projections of what you think, or hopes of for the future, and what you think will happen. We need to look at those and think about how many sort of rosy projections, how many risks, and sort of unthought through bad things, or sort of just have been ignored. Things that could go wrong have been ignored. Our projections are so close to, or our plans for the future, or thinking of what will happen in the future, are so close to sort of a best case scenario, not even close to a likely case, or even not even close enough to a likely case, let alone being close to a sort of a worst case scenario. And so we need to think about all these things, and I think the silent time or still time is probably the best time to think about it. To the extent that you are still committed to whatever you're doing, or you're actively talking and speaking to other people, you just don't have it's just not the right environment to engage in this kind of criticality, this sort of self-reflexivity of the self, to figure out which one of these mental biases could be operating. If you can identify, and I think very importantly with the sunk cost fallacy, if you can identify in an area of your life where your thoughts are at all operating in that sort of way, where you are committed and you're continuing to devote time and resources to something that is not good for you, to something that is not enriching your life, to something that is not promoting good in your life, to something that is not in any way fulfilling you, and you continue to do it because you think you've done it for so long, you can't think of what else to do. It's the only thing you can think about doing. It's the only option you have. Those sorts of thoughts match up very closely to a sunk cost fallacy, and you should think very seriously about how rational it is to be committed to an activity for those kinds of reasons. It doesn't seem at all rational to be committed in that sort of way, blindly and almost robotically, just because you've spent a lot of time on something. As we talked about in our last post, in the Stoic life, it is better to think about contributing in ways that are useful to the world and good for the world. And even if our contributions, even with the most well-intentioned efforts, we can fail, but that doesn't mean we should mope or continue to plow through on that, but we just move on to the next project, move on to the next contribution, move on to the next thing that we can do to add some sort of beauty and goodness to the world. And so I think the sunk cost fallacy is something that, in a silent, still moment, we're reflecting on our commitments to various things and commitments to various places in our life where we continue to put more effort. We need to think very carefully about if it at all resembles the sunk cost fallacy. And I just don't think these kind of thoughts, the kind of reflexivity needed to identify these biases, can come about in the normal busy flow of events and the very, very busy flow of day-to-day life. I think there's estimates now that the average worker gets 100 to 200 emails per day that he has to respond to. How can such a person at all have time to engage in that sort of self-reflexivity? It's impossible. It's impossible while doing that. And in addition, if that person has kids that they're bringing up and a marriage and various other commitments and bills to pay, there's just no time left to do any of that. So there has to be this sort of silent, stilled moment where all of that is sort of set aside, and we can focus and identify any of these fallacies. And because of that, because the silent, still moments are the only moments where these sorts of thoughts can hit one, and where we can identify these biases operating and sort of start to plan out ways to modify or can't eliminate the bias, at least sort of modulate it and reduce it to some way, shape, or form. Because of that, I think silence and stillness is a very important virtue, and it deserves to be cultivated for very valuable reasons. And I think Hahnemann has identified some very key, important mental biases, those and many others that he discusses in his book, that again, the virtue of silence and stillness needs to be cultivated to identify those biases in some way, shape, or form. So we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.